All right, let's bring in our guest in Vienna, Nikolai Sokov, who is a senior fellow at the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation and took part in many arms control negotiations. Gary Seymour joins us from Boston. He's a politics professor at Brandeis University and a former senior official in the U.S. National Security Council, responsible for non-proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. And in Brussels, Victor Gao, who is the vice president of the Center for China and Globalization, a leading Chinese think tank. He's also a former diplomat. Welcome to all three of you. Gary, I wonder if I can start by asking you this. According to this latest report, all of the 9 world's top nuclear-armed nations are apparently spending more on nuclear arms. Why is that happening?
Well, I agree with the report. All of the countries that have nuclear weapons believe they are essential, vital for their national security. So those countries that have nuclear weapons are spending money in order to maintain and modernize and in some cases expand their nuclear forces. And I would expect that trend to continue for the foreseeable future.
Nikolai, is this a trend that you see happening?
More or less, yes. I would say that very few countries actually now increase the number of nuclear weapons, but everyone is modernizing, especially the delivery means like missiles, submarines, and bombers. And I think more countries might actually join the trend toward increasing the numbers as well, but that's going to be in the future.
Nikolai, staying with you for a second, because one argument is that all of this is primarily because the US has decided to spend much more on its military defense budget off the back of the war in Ukraine, turbulence in the Middle East, and concerns about China's ambitions in the region. Is the US budget to blame for this turbocharging of this nuclear race around the world?
I would say that there are 2 main reasons why the United States is spending more. Reason one is that, generally speaking, it's more expensive in the United States. Yes, it's just the nature of the economic and political system. So generally, the United States spends more money to do the same things that other countries can do cheaper. So that's number one. Number two, the nuclear arsenal will, including an especially strategic arsenal, but not just strategic, that the United States now has is a legacy arsenal that's mostly inherited from the Cold War days. It's just getting very old, so almost all systems actually do need replacement. And that's really the main reason for spending more money. The United States is now just beginning actually the cycle of wholesale replacement, and yes, that's why it's spending more.
Victor,
but
the US,
Russia, for example, started the same cycle like 20 years ago.
Okay.
So
let's go to Victor, because Victor, according to Nikolai there, the US has only just started. China, we know, is judged to be the second largest spender when it comes to its nuclear arsenal, with a budget of $11.9 billion. That is well below the $51 billion spent by the United States. However, it is enough to cause concern, Victor, in the region. Why does China want more nuclear weapons?
First of all, I think mankind is at a very critical crosspoint, meaning either war or peace. And there are countries which are agitating for more war or expansion into other regions, or try to subjugate other countries to its dominance. Now, as far as China's concerned, China's military expenditure as a whole is only a fraction of that of the United States, and China never declared how many nuclear warheads it has. It makes it very clear China will have enough nuclear warheads to get even with whichever country which dares to launch a nuclear attack against China. That means China's nuclear weapons is purely for defensive purposes. China will never use nuclear weapons against the non-nuclear weapon states, and China will never use nuclear weapons against groups of countries which do not use nuclear weapons. I hope other countries, the United States and otherwise, will do the same as China, declaring that they will not be the first to use nuclear weapon, because Nuclear weapons cannot be used. Once you use one nuclear bomb, it will never stop. It will continue until mankind will be wiped out. So this is the critical moment we are. Let's focus on the things that really matter. That is, whatever that happens to the nuclear arsenals, mankind as a whole need to come up with a commitment that no country should be allowed to use nuclear weapons to start with.
We'll talk about hopes of a commitment to making sure that happens, Victor, a little bit later on. But turning back to you, Gary, we've heard a lot, particularly in Russia, invoking its nuclear arsenal as a means of warning Western states not to intervene in the conflict in Ukraine, even conducting simulated exercises of the use of tactical nuclear weapons on the border. Of all the zones in the world where there's likely to be a possible nuclear incident, it appears that it's likely to be in eastern Ukraine.
Well, I think when the war was going very badly for Russia, and Russian officials and experts were threatening to possibly use nuclear weapons, that threat was credible enough so that the U.S. and other Western countries were very cautious in providing weapons to Ukraine because they were afraid it would trigger a desperate Russian reaction, use of tactical nuclear weapons on the battlefield in Ukraine. I think since the war has settled into a stalemate, or even a slight advantage for Russia, those nuclear threats are less credible, and the Western countries have gradually, cautiously provided Ukraine with longer-range weapons, more capable weapons, and permission to use them on Russian territory. So for now, I think the threat of nuclear use in the Ukraine war is relatively low. But I do agree that if the war continues, as it looks like it will for years, and if the war begins to turn against Russia, if the Ukrainians begin to succeed on the battlefield, I think there's a greater risk that Russia will feel it has to resort to nuclear use in order to avoid losing the war.
Nikolai, at the time of recording, Vladimir Putin is visiting North Korea. He's in Pyongyang. What does the increased spending on nuclear weapons mean for countries with fledgling nuclear programs like North Korea?
Well, I don't think that there is a direct relationship between actually Russia and North Korean nuclear program right now. But let me actually say that I don't quite agree with Gary. To begin with, I really do not see any probability that Russia might use nuclear weapons against Ukraine itself. But I think it's quite possible that Western assistance to Ukraine might actually reach the level that's turning the tide sort of on the front lines. Yes, in that case, actually, Russia might try to escalate against NATO, not against Ukraine. We also need to understand that nuclear weapons are a political weapon, first and foremost. So the idea here is not to use nuclear weapons, but to threaten them quite credibly so that the other side changes policy. So I would say that's something that Russia might actually try. I think the probability is actually still quite high, and in fact actually rising as NATO gets more involved in Ukraine. But once again, I don't really see any threat or any use of nuclear weapons against Ukraine, but I do see a possible threat, also in the worst case, even use against Europe, just because when you get into an escalation dynamic, it's very easy to lose control.
Victor, what Nikolai has just clearly pointed out is that maybe there may not be the real desire to actually use these weapons on the battlefield, but nevertheless, their presence in arsenals around the world is still being used as a degree of political leverage. Of course, during the Cold War, there was that principle of mutually assured destruction, MAD, appropriately named MAD. whereby in the event of a nuclear war, both the attacker and the defender would be simultaneously annihilated. Do you think that principle of deterrence still exists today, Victor?
First of all, from the very beginning of the Russian-Ukrainian war, Russia has declared to the world that on the one hand, it is using conventional weapons for the battle in Ukraine, but on the other hand, it is holding very high in its possession nuclear weapons. I personally don't think Russia wants to use nuclear weapons in the theater of Ukraine. Russia wants to threaten to use nuclear weapons only against those countries, especially NATO member states, which may take actions more and more encroaching on Russia's sovereignty and territorial integrity to such an extent that Russia will feel compelled to use nuclear weapons against them. This is exactly why Russia, in more recent time, sailed their naval forces, including a nuclear submarine, to Cuba, and within very short distance from the Florida coast, the Russian fleet engaged in firing exercise very close to the United States, about 40 miles from the Floridan coast. This means that Russia is serious about using nuclear weapons to deter the United States and NATO member states, so that they know that there is a line that they should not cross over in the war in Ukraine. For example, if NATO member states allow the Ukrainian military forces to scramble off their F-16 fighter planes from their airport in their NATO member states, then Russia most likely will use nuclear weapons, technical or strategic, against them. And this will really lead to a very dangerous situation of complete loss of the situation, because as we just now discussed, no use of nuclear weapon should happen, because once you fire a nuclear weapon, a bomb, for example, then people keep firing nuclear bombs against each other. And even if people are not killed instantly by the nuclear explosion, the resulting nuclear winter will wipe us out. That's why I appeal on Russia as well as Ukraine to enter into serious discussions about ceasefire. And I also call on all NATO members no longer to pour more fuel onto the fire in the war in Ukraine, because you never know what will it lead to. And it may really lead to escalation and complete loss of the situation. And lo and behold, there will be a nuclear explosion.
Victor, the shadow or the spectre of what happened in Nagasaki and Hiroshima obviously casts a long shadow over today's world as well. But nevertheless, China, along with the US, along with the UK, France, many others, are spending vast sums of money on their nuclear arsenals. Gary, I wonder if I can turn the discussion on its head slightly and ask this, because one argument put forward by so-called nuclear weapons optimists is precisely that they avert direct conflicts between major powers. Should we, Gary, to some degree, welcome them?
I think it's certainly true that in the period after the Second World War, the presence of nuclear weapons, especially in the standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union, the presence of nuclear weapons certainly imposed caution and constraint on the leaders of both countries, because they recognized that the use of nuclear weapons would lead to mutual annihilation, as you said, mutually assured destruction. So from that standpoint, nuclear weapons did have a stabilizing impact. At the same time, as the other guests have said, if that deterrence fails because of miscalculation or escalation from a conventional conflict, the consequences would be catastrophic, not only for the countries involved, but for all of humanity. So I think there's still a strong argument for trying to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons beyond the 9 countries that already possess nuclear weapons and which are not going to give them up. So I think both are true. Nuclear weapons has tended to create stabilization, not only between the US and Russia, US and China, also India and Pakistan. But at the same time, I think we should try to limit the spread of nuclear weapons so that less countries have them.
Nikolai, turning to you, there is, just adding from what we've just heard from Gary there, an interesting effect of countries investing heavily in their nuclear arsenals. It's called the stability-instability paradox, that while the probability of direct conflict between nuclear powers reduces, it does increase the instances of minor or indirect conflict between countries. To what extent are nuclear weapons playing an impact in fueling existing low-level conflicts?
I would say the stability paradox is true, first. And second, I will not say fuel, but it does create an opportunity for such a conflict, yes, and that's exactly what we're now seeing in Ukraine. So basically, Russia says that the nuclear weapon state cannot be fully kind of defeated. So even if the war in Ukraine does not go well for Russia, it does think that it can leverage nuclear weapons so that it can avoid complete defeat. At the hands not really just of Ukraine, but of the entire West and the United States. I would say that Russia will actually proceed a bit more cautiously, in the sense that escalation will start at conventional kind of level with conventional strikes at NATO. But as I said, escalation can get out of hand. And then really no telling what's going to happen. I would say that we are living in a period that about as dangerous as the Cuban Missile Crisis, maybe somewhat actually less, but that's quite dangerous, and I think it's now growing.
Victor, we are living in a time almost as dangerous as the Cuban Missile Crisis, says Nikolai. But I want to ask you this, to what extent China is contributing to that? Because when we talk of nuclear stockpiles, we don't actually mean that all of them are deployed. They still need to have launch systems. But for the first time, China has deployed 24 weapons in a state of, quote, high readiness, which means that they can be fired at any time. Why is that, Victor?
First of all, I think all such reports are pure speculation. No one knows in the world how many warheads China has and how many warheads China has deployed for active duty service. This means that China's nuclear weapon program in itself is a mystery. And China's position is, as I mentioned, China will never be the first to use nuclear weapon against any country. And China will not use nuclear weapon against the non-nuclear weapon states or groups of countries which do not use nuclear weapon. And China will have sufficient amount of nuclear warheads to retaliate against any country, I mean any country, which dares to launch a nuclear attack against China. This is truly China's position, and China does not tell you how many warheads it has, how many warheads it has deployed, and I hope countries like Russia and the United States and Britain and France and others will do exactly as what China is doing, with enough warheads, but always commit not to be the first one to use nuclear weapons. That's the right thing for all the other nuclear powers to do.
Gary, turning to you, of course, as I mentioned earlier, we all know the devastating consequences of the use of atomic weapons, Nagasaki, Hiroshima, of course. But when we talk of the battlefield in Ukraine, there has been, and you've all mentioned it, discussion of the use of so-called tactical weapons. I just wonder whether the never again sentiment when it comes to nuclear weapons is somewhat softening in recent years.
Certainly, the threat to use nuclear weapons on the battlefield lowers the nuclear threshold because it wouldn't involve a direct attack on a civilian population and cities. But I think most experts believe that it would be very difficult to contain the use of nuclear weapons on the battlefield, that once they were used, it could easily escalate to counter use of nuclear weapons on the battlefield, and that could expand into a much broader nuclear conflict. So in theory, and certainly during the Cold War, the U.S. plan for the use of battlefield nuclear weapons against Soviet and Warsaw Pact conventional forces because the U.S. thought it was at a disadvantage. And the reverse is true now. Russia plans for the use of battlefield weapons against NATO because Russia thinks it's weaker than NATO. But fortunately, that proposition has never been tested. And I think it's very important to avoid conflict and a situation in which a nuclear power thinks it needs to resort to battlefield nuclear weapons in order to avoid defeat.
Thank you for that. Nikolai, as we reach the end of our discussion, as somebody who was directly involved in assisting and encouraging the disarmament process over the many decades, I just wonder whether you feel that the work of the past 50 years as being somewhat undone. We are nowhere near the kind of stockpiles that existed at the height of the Cold War, when the USSR had 40,000 warheads, the US 23,000. But do you feel that things are going in the wrong direction, Nikolai?
Yes, definitely things go in the wrong direction. Let me say that numbers are not the most important actual parameter there. I don't really see large-scale use of nuclear weapons, but even one nuclear weapon or two nuclear weapons, I think would be quite catastrophic, especially if you talk about using them in Europe. And there's really no way to limit civilian casualties, even in case they're used against military targets. Okay. Well, yes, I have been in arms control and disarmament for now 44 years, actually. Unfortunately, I see that all the treaties, all the regimes that I worked on are now being dismantled and disappearing, and that's very, very actually sad. So I don't really like what I'm seeing now, unfortunately. Yes,
okay, very pessimistic view of what's happening. Nikolai, very briefly, Victor, we are running out of time. I mean, like any Mexican standoff, all of the world's nuclear powers are pointing their weapons potentially at each other. For there to be real progress, everybody needs to simultaneously put down their weapons and back away. What needs to happen, Victor, to encourage a diffusion of these tensions?
It is very difficult at this moment. And I think of the utmost importance now is to bring the war in Ukraine to a stop as quickly as possible, to prevent it from escalating from conventional warfare to nuclear warfare, and from preventing it from spilling over to other NATO member states, because otherwise mankind is playing with fire with this war in Ukraine, because sooner or later, if it is left as it is, it may explode in a nuclear way. And then it is not only the Ukrainian people who suffer the consequences, mankind as a whole will suffer the consequences of that. It is time to stop the war in Ukraine as quickly as possible.
It is time to stop the war, Victor, and mankind is playing with fire. It has been an illuminating, if somewhat bleak, conversation. Hopefully, we found something to be hopeful of there. Gary Seymour, Nikolai Sokov, Victor Gao, a pleasure to have all three of you on Inside Story.